The Vince Dixon Show of history, current events, and the rule of law.
Welcome everyone to the inaugural broadcast of the Vince Dixon Show. The focus of this program will be Vince's perspective as a historian on the purposes and evolution of government. That's a topic that should be on everybody's agenda today. However, many of us are distracted in this information age by our fascination with the internet, the web, and now artificial intelligence. Social media has actually become a major distraction for many of us. As a result, we need a vehicle for providing insight and a historical context in order to understand where we are at this time in history and how we might go forward as a nation. This is Vincent's agenda. I'm Ron Latanison. I'm your host for today and the moderator of the Wilson Science and Technology Forum at the Jenks Center. Vince is the historian of the Wilson Forum. He is well known in Winchester, and it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Vince Dixon. Vince, welcome.
Thank you, Ron, and hello to everyone in the audience. And I'm known beyond Winchester as well, having grown up in Alston and lived in Cambridge for many years, and now in Winchester for a number of years. This is a revival of a long ago program intersecting with other programs in the Currents Media family, which we will refer to along the way. On this program, we will explore a range of facts, areas of knowledge, and perspectives on our world in the broadest ways possible and in detailed aspects. We welcome questions, thoughts, and ideas, contact information near the end of the show. When opinions are expressed, we will seek to identify them as opinions. We live in a world where we need to explore more history, more facts about current events, and more thoughtful thinking about our future and the future in general. As an introduction, I will touch on my own personal history, touch on aspects of knowledge in different fields. This program looks at a somewhat lesser-known foundational transition central to the history of the United States, the Suffolk Resolves. This brief little snippet will give a flavor of some of the programs we will be doing in greater depth. It is by which Massachusetts, the Suffolk Resolves, established its independence and moved forward in a somewhat typical constitutional development by which Massachusetts evolved. Joining me on most of these shows will be co-host Ron Latanison, also a person interested in history and the rule of law. Ron has become a friend through the Wilson Science and Technology Forum, from which I have been more recently honored by accepting their designation as their historian. This introductory show not only is a bit of an introduction, I'm talking about my own profile and how the rule of law intersects with the purposes of government, very much issues of the 1770s, of the 1600s, and of the 21st century as well. And a closing reprise and other subjects and topics we'll talk about. And sometime in the next few months, we'll also have a reprise of an earlier recent forum with Reverend Nick Myers and Father Paul Clifford on Rerum Novarum, an encyclical from 1890 that is very current because of Pope Leo XIV and how social policy and social justice is made. As we look at some of the information up here, next, this is a picture of myself on Cambridge Common at an event on a sunny day. We don't get as many of them as we might like around here. I am not only a historian, but a civics expert and have done a variety of media commentating over the years. Next. This is myself at the John Harvard statue in late August when Harvard doesn't have anyone to give tours, and many of us who are Harvard graduates do give tours. And this was kind of on a warm day, and this was a picture shot by Harvard Gazette looking at the other people who do tours when Harvard doesn't do their own tours. And I have actually an interesting background to some people, homeschooled by my parents from kindergarten through high school in the late 1950s and early 1960s. My associate in arts and Bachelor of Arts cum laude with honors from Harvard Extension School and Harvard Graduate School of Education, a master's degree in education, and additional graduate work at Harvard Law School and Radcliffe Institute. Next. Exploring American history is part of what we will do, not just looking at it, not just looking at the dates, but the meaning of it and how it leads us to where we are today. Next. Massachusetts has actually been central to the constitutional development not only of itself, but as kind of a gift to the world in what we have done. When the Pilgrims were blown off course and wound up in Plymouth, they realized they didn't have any legal authority. So they wrote a contract based on their agreements with each other, the Mayflower Compact from 1620, that authorized their local government. The Mass State Charter was issued in England in 1629 and physically brought here to Massachusetts, which was quite important because it established a self-government here. The oath of a free man within a couple of years that establishes both a sense of loyalty and responsibility as a free man. The Suffolk Resolves from 1774, when Massachusetts became functionally independent. The Massachusetts Constitution, written in 1780 by John Adams, and the Massachusetts Compromise that assisted the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And this is important because it also has actual granting and specificity of human rights in that. What we call the Bill of Rights is part to that. And then in this way, Massachusetts really gives a gift to the United States and the world in terms of a mentality of constitutional government and rule of law. Next. The Suffolk Resolves is little known by many. At times in history it has been better understood, and at this 250th anniversary, as we talk about these various aspects of our history, this is quite important to look at next. Chester, by the way, is an early American anthem, and this reflects the fact that politics does actually cross over into aspects of our daily lives. And we'll talk about that and music and the importance of the church in both music and in theology that lays the foundations of self-government and commerce. Next. Next photo coming up will be a photo of the Suffolk Resolves House. Men who were concerned about the increasingly and apparently hostile British authorities began to organize their own authority and authorities, and this led to the functional independence of Massachusetts. Government is here. There were already town meetings that were quite autonomous. They created their own self-government, relatively local, grassroots responsive, and passionately organized, not worrying about what might be on the other side of a large ocean with people who didn't really understand what had developed over the decades. The purposes of government, which is one of the things I talk about in talking about the intersection of history and civics next. This is the house of the Milton Historical Society, parts of which were where the Suffolk Resolves were discussed and ultimately passed. Next. This was a remarkable gathering of delegates that really was founding a new government, and the Declaration of Independence is actually kind of an echo because it has grievances, why people are kind of fed up with the British misrule or lack of engagement, and how to take government and make it more accountable to those people who were freed men. Eventually slavery is ended and we continue the pyramid of widening the pyramid of justice. The most significant ride of Paul Revere was not to Lexington and Concord, a short ride that didn't work out too well for him, but a 5-day ride to Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress receives the Suffolk Resolves, reviews them, and endorses them. Now, Georgia did not send delegates. The other colonies or states weren't there yet, but they did endorse what Massachusetts had already done, and you notice this is September of 1774, long before July of 1776. Next. This is another example of culture and politics mixing. The Paul Revere Bowl is often given as a gift or a trophy to sports teams or individuals for their accomplishments. It was originally designed to honor 92 Massachusetts legislators who refused an order to repeal a letter against the king and that system. And it is still part of our culture today, though not everyone even understands the importance of this. Much like the fact most of us drink coffee, not tea, because it would have been unpatriotic to drink tea. Next. This is Dr. Joseph Warren, who in many ways is as important or even more important to Massachusetts as Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. He reported for duty at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though a major general by rank, he said, "I will fight as a private," and he died on that hill, much lamented, but his grievances and his recommendations together with Paul Revere, they are the two absolute leaders, the various clubs and cells that were leading towards the establishment of this new and ultimately successful government next. These are the Sons of Liberty, many of them well-known, a few little less known, kind of a gallery. Samuel Adams, Benedict Arnold before he crossed over because of a hurt ego and some money, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, James Otis, Paul Revere, James Swan, Alexander McDougall, Benjamin Rush, Charles Thompson, Joseph Warren, Marinus Willett, Oliver Wolcott, Christopher Gadsden, Chaim Solomon, Hercules Mulligan, Thomas Melville, and Isaac Sears, and these are very significant in many ways. In future programs, we'll look at some of the women patriot leaders, because Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren were just as surely patriot leaders intersecting with this small group of people who led Massachusetts to successful freedom next. The Sons of Liberty, it's important to realize, were both above ground, part of the effort to resolve or talk about the grievances against the British misrule, and below ground. They were the ones who instigated some of the mobs and riots and supported some of the militias before they were fully authorized next. This is a picture we started with. As a historian, I had the honor for 3 years to welcome the rider who was representing the ride of William Dawes on Patriots' Day to Cambridge Common. And that particular year, it was a sunny day, and this is a great picture from the City of Cambridge photographer. Next. The 19 resolves of the Suffolk Resolves are the first distinct establishment of a fully independent American government, yet in many ways a continuation of Massachusetts' European settler independence. It is a new description of a new rule of law based on the consent of the governed without outside or higher authority. Thus, in the terms of Massachusetts, it's not really a revolution because the success of these efforts leads to the restoral of daily life and its continued expansion to more people. Thus, it was a war of independence. Next. And we take a few minutes here to chat with Ron, and feel free to ask me some questions, and we can explore some of this territory.
Yes, let's do that, Vincent. You've given us a very broad brush description of the importance that Massachusetts played in the evolution of our Constitution and in our history. For example, the Sons of Liberty. Tell us how did the Sons of Liberty come together? What was their motivation and what was their goal?
They were actually kind of a series of ad hoc groups. There is no question that the Masonic lodges had a role. The Masons are a secret society of a sort, fraternal and charitable largely, but often have had people who are involved in government in local communities. And so you'll find that many of the leaders were Masonic masters. Joseph Warren, well honored by the Masons to this day, as some of these other leaders. But it was really an ad hoc group of people who got together. And remember, we already had, or our predecessors did, by 1686, when Sir Edmund Andros was sent from London to create a Dominion of New England, town meetings were already quite autonomous and actually governing their local towns. And he said you could only have one town meeting, one night, on an agenda that would be approved by the royal government. They said, no, you don't do that. Because, in fact, town meeting was also a church meeting. Cambridge, not surprisingly, in the early 1700s was the first place where the church was allowed to have a separate annual meeting, where you see the church now separating from the body politic, but that remains an establishment until the 1830s, and that influences, as the religion evolves, their sense of freedom and individual conscience evolves as well.
Well, when did the organization called the Sons of Liberty evolve? When did it begin? Was that prior to the evolution of Massachusetts Constitution?
Oh, long before that.
Long before, okay.
You know, the Sons of Liberty are really ad hoc,
right?
And there were a series of small clubs. And it turns out from people who've done some research, one of the good fortunes of us is, other than the War of Independence, we've not had war in our soil really very much, 9/11 and some other incidents certainly. So documents going back centuries are here to be perused by scholars. Not all the documents of John Quincy Adams have really been understood or
Yeah.
deconstructed, if you will. So these were really ad hoc groups. Each town, because there were no cities at the time, had their own ad hoc group of people, some of whom might be Masonic leaders, some of whom might be militia leaders. Remember, militia elected new officers every year, sometimes the same individual, oftentimes others. And there was no standing army, but some of the militia had served with British forces during earlier efforts, and so there was some military knowledge. More important was these people believed in reading and were largely self-taught. Schooling was available, public schooling was available, but Henry Knox, who we will touch on in later programs, was the one who became the head of artillery in the Continental Army, and he's the one who, from the reading of the books in his own bookstore, taught himself about artillery, and that was what drove the British from Boston in March of 1776, which will be an important event.
I guess what I'm wondering, though, given the timing, there was obviously at that point a wish to break away from the King of England, to declare independence. Were the Sons of Liberty the spark that led to the Declaration of Independence? Were they the key to bring that about?
There's one of the other things we'll talk about down the road is what I call the Massachusetts Independence 12.
Yeah.
There were 12 different events, some of which we clearly recognize, like the Boston Massacre and the Battle of Bunker Hill. But in 1768, there was a convention of Massachusetts towns, this is 1768, that debated actively whether to break from England at that point.
Yeah.
The relative moderates won, and they said, well, let's just file our grievances. The British Royal Governor, who's in the old State House, as we call it now, about 300 yards away from Faneuil Hall, sent them a note that said, you can't meet. I've just actually dissolved the legislature, and I'm running Massachusetts, or I'm ruling it. And they said, so what? And, well, less than 10 years later, Massachusetts goes to independence. But you have to realize that when Andros came, by 3 years later, people were so angry and fed up that disturbances were organized in Boston on April 18th, curiously a date in history of 1689. And on April 19th, the royal governor met the militia because he said he needed some help, and they said, we think that's the case, and they arrested him and put him in a fort in Boston Harbor and restored government to themselves because they believed they were self-governing. And so in some ways, Massachusetts, when it started with the Pilgrims in 1620 and Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay in 1630, started as an autonomous country, and every time there was an attempt by British authority to bring them under a tighter rule, they said, well, you don't kind of get the idea, we do.
Well, that's an important point. I mean, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which we're going to celebrate in July of this year, was in 1776.
Right.
The Constitution of the United States didn't emerge till 1787. Right. But all of these things were preceded by the equivalents in the country of Massachusetts. Is that not correct?
That is certainly the case, and that slide that we'll come back to at a later point, the constitutional development, every one of these documents is constitution-like. And the Constitution is a fundamental starting point by which you create a rule of law.
Right.
And in fact, what has developed from the U.S. Constitution, thrown open to the world. Some people have different views of it, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the founding document of the United Nations after World War II, was written by a team headed by Eleanor Roosevelt. And the idea of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, very clear that the countries that believe in the rights of individuals and expands that. So you take the Massachusetts history of constitutional development from 1620 and 1630 to 1780, the U.S. Constitution in the late 1780s, the Massachusetts Compromise that makes it possible, and it is the gift of Massachusetts, not just as a leader, but as an innovator in terms of so many things we've done. Not surprising that some of the other things we'll talk about is not just public schools and education, but mass private schools, public schools, education, the creation of normal schools, and the great Horace Mann whose statue is on the State House grounds by a woman sculptor in the 1800s. And you start to get a sense that we're not just leaders, but we're innovators. We test out the ideas that we come up with. And part of our history is simply we're ahead of the pack, and part of it is we expect we can come up with new ideas. And innovation is where inventions get applied to life.
Now, you mentioned the Suffolk Resolves, and you pointed out that it was a new description of a new rule of law for Massachusetts. The rule of law basically says that no one is above the law, right? That all people, institutions, entities of all kinds are accountable to the laws of the land.
And the idea is that public officials serve people under the law, not tell people what the law is.
Right.
And by the way, most public officials, until you get to the latter part of the 1800s, who are in elective office are elected for one-year terms. The governor included,
I think
by the way.
it's interesting to me, Vince, that the rule of law began at this stage, basically, with Massachusetts again. And I think about the evolution of the United States, but I realize that Massachusetts has played an instrumental role in that evolution. So, for example, today, there are many people who are concerned that many people are ignoring the rule of law in the United States. We have many examples of that. What should we do as a nation to bring the rule of law back into focus in the United States?
Well, that's a great teaser for our future shows.
Right.
Which we're going to explore.
Give us a hint. Tell us what's coming.
Each of those topics.
So
let's look at our listing of, let's go to our credits.
Here we go.
The coming shows of the Vince Dixon Show will include exploring the purposes of government and its evolution. We've started to talk about that. Francis Perkins, who was actually the author of the New Deal, supported by the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration, the importance of Evacuation Day in the year of 2026, the great event, the history of industrial revolutions, which is where society is evolving today, with largely important leadership in Massachusetts, artificial intelligence that is transforming our civilization, and an interesting encyclical of Rerum Novarum we mentioned at the beginning, and we'll reprise an interesting interfaith forum by an Episcopal and a Catholic priest that looks at that, and how to educate for transformational change next. This show, The Vince Dixon Show, seeks to provide a range of factual descriptions of history, its meanings, its results, and a lot more. Opinions expressed are those of the individuals stating them in good faith in the pursuit of historical understanding, civic education, and public knowledge. We seek to inform, not to offend, and we welcome any comments, suggestions, or ideas for other shows. Next. Vince Dixon, myself, as an historian, I've delivered numerous programs on history, civics, government, public policy, and related fields. I'm available as a speaker, teacher, and/or public commentator to deliver a portfolio of presentations on various interesting topics, and or to assist with research in the pursuit of improved and civilized understandings of knowledge in these fields and related disciplines. Those interested in further contact can be in contact vincedixon99 at yahoo.com, VINCEDIXON99 at yahoo.com. Next. This edition of the Vince Dixon Show is copyrighted by Vincent Lawrence Dixon. Ron Latanyanson, our co-host, has helped in the conception and detail of this program. This particular program has been recorded and produced at WinCam, Winchester Community Access and Media, but does not necessarily reflect the views of WinCam or its staff. Content that has been utilized and or shown has been deliberately screened to meet the standards of public domain and fair use. Emily Ann Kernline is production assistant and liaison on behalf of Massachusetts Presentations and Dixon Enterprises. Vincent Lawrence Vince Dixon is the producer of this edition of the Vince Dixon Show. Next. And thank you for watching and listening.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. We hope you'll come back for future editions. Take care.